Thank you very much, Judy, and thank you, all of you beautiful people, for being here today. I want to begin by just offering my thanks and my gratitude to the Radcliffe. Really an extraordinary opportunity, I think we all feel, to have our work honored in this way and to really discover what these projects are. And so in that spirit, most of what I'll be presenting today really are things that I've begun to think about in the last couple of months since I've been here. So I ask your patience and for you to receive it in that way. And so I thank you. I thank you for honoring my work and for honoring our work together and having us here for the year. Thankful also I have two students from UC Riverside who've begun programs here at Harvard this year, and Ritdau and Gabriela, and I dedicate this to you. And Rebecca as well, if she's come in the back. So. If I am getting ready to speak at length about ghosts, inheritance, and generations of ghosts, which is to say about certain others who are not present nor presently living either to us, inside us, or outside us, it is in the name of justice. Derrida, Spectres and Marx. In the beginning there was ice, glacial ice, now heavy with the weight of human history, bearing down from one layer to the next. It records a solemn imprint of human loss. The collapse of indigenous populations across this hemisphere in the 16th century is legible in the geological record. The so-called Orbis Spike refers to a measurable drop in carbon dioxide levels recorded in the Antarctic glacial ice core in the precise period of my study, 1570 to 1620. To explain the Orbis Spike, some climate change scientists conclude that the mortality crisis suffered by native peoples led to a near cessation of indigenous agriculture, followed by a period of rapid reforestation. After the cataclysm, the earth strangely appears to gasp as the indigenous population tumbles to its nadir, a sharp intake of breath as if in response to some trauma. Last year, two British climatologists argued that the 16th century Orbis Spike is the preferred boundary marker for the beginning of the Anthropocene. Their intriguing yet contested conclusion is that it is precisely this moment of human-wrought catastrophe that signals the current geological age, the age of the Anthropocene, in which human activity is the dominant influence on climate and the environment. The human catastrophe that orients my reflections this afternoon is thus legible in geological time. Ice is more penetrable to the suffering of humans than God, it would seem. In Mexico, both the Spanish and indigenous survivors of the collapse regarded the Christian God as a remote and dispassionate observer of the events he himself had wrought. My concern is precisely to explore religious experience in this context of crisis and calamity, religion at the dawn of the Anthropocene. So I'll begin by saying that my intention is to first provide some background conceptually to what I want to talk about today, to propose some conceptual categories. And then I want to look at the way in which the sort of the landscape of the Christian imaginary is shaped in this period, right? Both for the Spanish and for indigenous communities. And I want to look at the divergence, really, of these landscapes of the imaginary after the collapse. And in doing that, to show how the church itself sort of shapes itself, defines itself and reconstitutes itself as an institution after this cataclysm. Okay? In the New World, the Spanish referred to each ravaging epidemic as a mortandad, a death event of apocalyptic scale. So my story this afternoon begins with the mortandad, with the mortality crisis itself. And the story I will tell is one of conquest and crisis, of affliction, of devastation and disaster. An intimate story told up close, which is the way of historians, but with the eye to the larger implications for ourselves and our self-understanding, which is the way of scholars of religion. My argument is this, that the mortandad, the indigenous mortality crisis of the 16th century, is the point of genesis, the cosmological point of origin for Christianity in the New World. Born from this moment, Christianity in the Americas, I imagine, as an ecclesia ex mortuis, a church from the dead and a church of the dead. The ecclesia ex mortuis is always defined in relation to the death event, as to the dead left in its wake. The ecclesia ex mortuis orients and reorients itself in relation to the mortandad that defines its origin, not just in relation to the singular death event of disease and mortality crisis, but in relation to the multiple death worlds wrought by colonialism. Forged by the death event, the ecclesia ex mortuis is defined by the dead and by those who survived them, by those who claimed the dead and those who have abandoned them, those who had given up and those who persisted. As the ecclesia ex mortuis, the New World Church is not a phoenix, rising from flames, remade and reborn. Rather, the ecclesia ex mortuis, the religion that emerges from the disaster of colonialism and collapse, is a religion rescued from rubble, rescued without necessarily being redeemed, a salvage religion. So I want to stop and say something here about the relationship between epidemics and colonialism. In the 16th century, indigenous peoples and Spanish observers struggled to try to understand the origins, the cause of indigenous death, of their own deaths. There was no consensus, I would say, right? Was it bad conditions, hard labor, the violence of the conquest? Was it particular vulnerability to disease? Those questions were unresolved in the time. And I think they're still unresolved among historians today, those who are considering these contexts today. I see really that epidemics are not just the kind of antecedent that paves the way for colonialism, nor are they sequela of colonialism, but really they are co-identified with it. They are inseparable from it. So they are, and that is why I regard them as man-made, in essence, right? So the origins of man-made mass death, and for those of you who know the work of Edith Wishograd, she is here and you will see her again. So. And I want to say that in my thinking about how to engage the dead, I've been really aided by the work of Vince Brown, who's here today, and thinking about the dead as a generative social force that shapes social institutions and shapes history. So I'm grateful for that insight that I bring to these materials. So I'm going to now talk a little bit about what this collapse is and talk about what illness particularly we're talking about here. And then I'm going to move on to really look at these two landscapes and the way, and I'm going to look at two very particular documents, two very particular kinds of materials to try to get at the ways that the Christian imagination is shaped in this moment of collapse. And in general, so I'm working with unpublished manuscript materials from the Archivo de Indies, the Archive of the Indies in Seville, But today, while I'll refer to some of those, I'm actually going to focus on published sources that may be a little more familiar to some people. So the topic, the sort of period of collapse, right, in Mexico, of steep decline over a course of about 50 years. The first, an epidemic of smallpox. And these numbers, these are a variation of Cook and Bora, the famous Berkeley demographers, numbers at the middle of the 20th century. They radically revised the count of the indigenous population of Mexico and of the Americas, really, and they radically revised it up. And this number of 22 million to start really is sort of on the middle low end of their estimate. This author has chosen to anchor the numbers there. And then I do want to say that I disagree with his suggestion of Cocolitzli is the name, the Nahuatl people, the Nahuatl name for the disease. And I think the consensus is probably typhus in 1545. But you can see these steep periods of decline. And probably the steepest one really is that 1545, where you really see that plummet. This is the period that I'm interested in, and I think of it as the corner of collapse, basically, that point at which the population tumbles to its very lowest point and remains there for about 250 years, never really to recover. So I'm looking at that precise bend, that corner. And the illness that the indigenous people called Cocolitzli, I'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute, it has been, I think, fairly conclusively determined to be an epidemic of hemorrhagic fever, an arenaviral hemorrhagic fever, characterized by internal and external hemorrhage, transmitted by rodents to humans. And a really interesting study in 2000 attributed to kind of tectonic agricultural shifts under colonial rule, in particular the introduction of wheat and the increase in stores of wheat and also stores of corn that increased the rodent reservoir population. So I want to say they're not virgin soil diseases. These are native-born. This is a native-born illness. And it's an illness that overwhelmingly takes the lives of indigenous peoples, but there are also some Spanish who are susceptible, as well as Africans in Mexico. But predominantly affected by far is the indigenous population. Okay, so there's a map. People like maps, so so I'm really thinking about New Spain overall, a larger story. I want to tell about American Christianity. Sort of, if you can think about when we talk about the origins of American Christianity, we think of Plymouth Rock, Plymouth Plantation, and I want to shift that axis. I'm always trying to shift it. Tenochtitlan, like, now becomes the center, right, of the origins of the American story of American Christianity. But largely, what I'm talking about here, and the sources come from the larger area of the Viceroyalty of Mexico, and this is where there's a real, one of the large demographic centers, right, population centers before the arrival of Europeans. Here. The Amazon, the Andes, right? And really also that I'm looking at the Nahua area and the Maya area. And those are the sources that I'm working with. So for those who want a reminder about this period, what I'm really talking about is the early decades of Spanish mission in the Americas. The first friars are Franciscan mendicant friars. They arrive in 1524. There are 12 of them, a symbolic number. They march into Mexico City. They process into Mexico City, where they're ceremonially received by Cortez, who reverences them. I think he kisses their skirts or their hands. And really turns over. So that the spiritual conquest then follows on the heels of the military conquest in a very real way. So my concern really here are mostly the mendicant orders, the Franciscans, the Augustinians, the Dominicans, and those who are working in communities of indigenous Indian communities, Indian pueblos, and their sort of millennial dream for a new Christendom, right, an American Christendom that would guide them over the next 50 years, right, between 1524, I would say, in the onset of this epidemic. That sort of fantasy, that desire. And over those first 5 decades, I think we can read in the record fluctuations of optimism and despair for the friars. In the big picture, I want to say what happens in the course of this epidemic, right? So this final, that corner of collapse, right? When that corner is turned, is that the mendicant orders really come to perceive, and you'll see the evidence and the sources that I talk about here, but they come to perceive that the New World Church is over. It's come to an end. With the death of the indigenous population, there is no more a future. And so, or a future as they imagine this sort of indigenous Indian Christian Franciscan version of Christianity, of Christendom. And so what happens is they retreat from the missionary frontier. They retreat from pueblos de indios, the indigenous communities. They consolidate their personnel in urban areas, in Mexico City and other urban areas. And they really thrive and prosper there. And then their future and their fate really comes to shape the kind of the New World City, urbanization, and from this, I think we see the origins of mestizo Christianity and the origins of the Baroque also, right? So that retreat into the urban areas, consolidation in the urban areas, the rise of Baroque Christianity. I want to talk about the sort of effective positionalities that I've been struggling with in my sources, trying to get my head around in terms of the ways in which the friars see themselves and understand their labors. So in my work, I'm coming very close to them, right? I'm intimately involved in their writings and their lives, and I'm thinking, you know, the sort of self-perception, their identity as conservadores de indios is really at the core. So they are conservers of the indigenous population. That becomes very early part of their identity. They are trying to keep indigenous people alive. And then what happens is there's a pairing in the manuscript sources that I'm coming across, which is a pairing of a kind of dual mission for the mendicants, which is the mission of conservación and conversión. So conversion and conservation become a joined mission. And I think there's a sort of affect then that comes from this moment, right, of worry, anxiety, care, concern, pity, poignancy, and this sort of pietà vision, which I've published before and think about this image quite a bit, this Jose Clemente Orozco's friar and the Indian, Franciscan and the Indian, right, of sort of an image of care, right, and rescue, even as the person is dying in the friar's arms. Right? Ultimately, I think in the epidemic that I'm looking at, the friars come to realize that identity as conservadores de indios, that they have failed to conserve the population. So, for example, in 1582, the Augustinian provincial, so right in the end of the epidemic, Pedro Suárez de Escobar writes the Spanish king, and he's mourning this collapse, right? This end point of the indigenous population, and he writes, it was a disastrous shipwreck in which our holy religion has sunk to the bottom of the sea. So the sense of it as over, as final. You know, the reality is, of course, in that retreat to the urban areas, they prosper. The religious orders prosper. So in a sense, though, the church has ended before it's even really begun, in a sense. So I want to talk about landscape now, right? So the remaining time, I want to explore these two landscapes of the Christian imagination, the Christian imaginaire that emerge after this epidemic, or in the wake of the epidemic. And the first for the friars, for the religious personnel, for the Spanish missionaries, is this: the collapse, the death is most tangible, most immediate in their perception of a depopulated land, a land of empty roads, roads that have been emptied of people, that are abandoned. And so this is the landscape that I want to think about, right? This idea of empty roads. And in some way, I think the landscape of the Ecclesiax Mortuis, right, is really a landscape of the dead, a land of the dead. And so this is a source here that a Spanish source that's writing about the Micatlali, which is the Nahua concept of a land of the dead, a tierra de difuntos, right? And that this is how they regard, this is in this moment, how the Spanish Christian imaginary in Mexico is regarding the New World, the landscape of the New World, right? So empty roads, abandoned roads, this is a tangible sign as evidence of the death of the Indians. And there's a way in which these roads, I think, are full of pathos and sentiment and drive them forward into the cities and in retreat from that vision. So to some of the documents I'm working with, the Bishop of Mexico, Grand Inquisitor Pedro Contreras, kind of was holed up in the course of the epidemic in his home, his cathedral home, and then right as it's crested, after about 18 months, he comes out and he walks 800 leagues to survey his diocese. He had postponed this trip for almost 2 years, and then he writes a letter describing a wasteland. It was much to consider and contemplate, he writes, to see the land so depopulated, a land that in the time of Montezuma was swarming with people. It seemed like there was no remedy that it could ever be that way again, because the Indians that remain in the land are being consumed with great speed. He goes on, having witnessed the state of the provinces, their greatly reduced populations, and the sites from antiquity that so clearly show how great the population once was, it fills one with grief and pity to see these superb ruins, which so clearly mark the great diminishment of the population. Along the same lines, the Bishop of Michoacan at the same time writes, he's an Augustinian friar, he'd been in Mexico for half a century, and in October of 1581, he writes, one feels the loss most in the loneliness and emptiness of the roads and towns, and what is most terrifying is that it does not cease to continue to take lives here and there, even though so very few remain. Mexico City was truly a valley of tears, una valle de lágrimas. So I want now to bring this reading into a more familiar document. This is Sahagún Bernardino, Franciscan recorder, chronicler, encyclopedia, editor of encyclopedias, I would say, in the 16th century. His Historia, his History of the Things of New Spain is 12-volume encyclopedic, 12 books, really, bound in 3 volumes that chronicle the culture of Mesoamerica, are probably our most important source for understanding Mesoamerican populations before the conquest, because the Spanish destroyed much artifacts, right, and objects that might have assisted us. So the interesting thing about this book is that the Getty Villa, maybe a decade back or something, in the last 10 years, repatriated a bunch of Italian masterpieces, sent them back to Italy. The Getty Villa is this sort of, hotbed of Greek and Roman antiquities, right? And so they had repatriated, they had returned these Italian works with the understanding, the agreement, that they would be able to receive on loan Italian masterpieces, right? So on the first, the moment arises, and they say, the Getty Villa curatorial staff say, what we want, the first thing we want, is the Florentine Codex. So Sahagún's Codex, his 3 volumes, are in the library in Florence, right? And they were shocked, right? Because they're expecting some Italian masterwork, right? And the person apparently on the other end of the phone didn't even know what this was and had to figure it out. So for the first time in 400 years, in 2010, 1 volume of the Florentine Codex came to the Getty Villa, and it was on display there, and I took students to see it. And at the opening, I believe it was the ambassador, one of the ambassador, Mexican ambassador, said, we may not be able to let this go back. We might have to keep it here. So really, really, everyone sort of laughed nervously in that moment, like, is he serious? But really quite extraordinary. So the work is beautifully illustrated. So Sahagún is collaborating. So in the midst of the epidemic, of this particular epidemic, and Dinah Kerpel has described this beautifully, the art historian, in the midst of this epidemic, Sahagún is holed up in a studio, a workshop, with perhaps some portion of 22 indigenous artists and illustrators and experts, cultural experts, creating this document. And it is Nahua on the one side, with Spanish translation on the other. So the original text is Nahua, and the Spanish is the translation. And then these gorgeous images, right? Just an extraordinary, beautiful work. So what I have been working on, I think, is something that, so far, I don't know if anyone is writing about this, but I've found this sort of interesting thing in Sahagún's, in book 11 of his volume dedicated to the kind of earthly things, to objects, to things of the natural world, in chapter 8. So it's a catalog of indigenous culture, basically, and flora and fauna of the New World, right? And so what he's done is this section is supposed to be dedicated to caminos, to roads in the Nahua culture before the arrival of the Spanish. And the whole 12 series volume ends, right, with the arrival of Cortez. That's the final scene of these 12 books. But anyway, so on this side, it's all about roads. And the indigenous scribes, the Nahua scribes, have written. I'm going to read some of the things they say about roads, kind of. But then on the left side, rather than translation, we have a really interesting interruption, which is Sahagún takes this moment to write about the epidemic. And there's 6 pages dedicated to the epidemic. And he's sort of fitted in this. So this sort of landscape that he is painting in the narrative is really one of an imperfect, broken Christian orb, right? In which Christianity has traveled across the globe, kind of failed wherever it's gone, and has finally come to Mexico, where it's also just failed. It's ended. The Christian mission is ended. And I'm going to read from that. But first I want to read from these incredible Nahua discussion of roads, right, that he doesn't translate. And in the main published version of this, the editors decided to translate the Nahua and to kind of leave out the Spanish. So the sort of litany of roads that the Nahua scribes offer. So for example, regarding main or principal roads, they write, I travel the road, I travel the main road, I widen it, broaden it, narrow it, make it narrow. I sweep the road, I clean it up, I improve it, I take it straight ahead. I go directly along it. I go straight on it, I go down it, I go up it, I travel directly along it, I follow its curve, I follow its curves. I double back on it, I follow the winding road. I break off my journey along it. I regard the smooth road. I remove trees from the road. I clean the road. I improve the road. I place myself on the main road. I fill the main road with sheep. I herd them. I bring them to the main road. I join the main road. I come to join it. I join it there. I depart from it. So this sort of litany of roads, right? And then, meanwhile, Sahagún writes, having passed through mountains and valleys and roads of diverse kinds, it seems to me the opportune time to talk about the roads that the church itself has traveled. Until arriving at this last dwelling, where it is now a pilgrim, sowing the doctrine of the gospel. And he goes on to say, as the church has passed from Europe, from Palestine into Europe, into Germany, Italy, into Africa, it's failed pretty much everywhere it's gone, right? It's failed in each of these places to take deep roots. Mexico, for Sahagún, was a land of infinite possibility, but he writes, the Catholic faith has found infertile territory here. There were once a diversity of people in this land, he writes, but these are pretty much finished, and those that remain are on the road to their end as well. It is a great land here to sow Christianity, but difficult to harvest. It seems to me that the Catholic faith is not long for these lands, because the people head to their end with great haste, not only for the bad treatment they receive, but because of the diseases God has sent upon them. But it seems to me that our Lord has opened a new road for the church, the road to Asia and the Philippines. And as the Catholic Church is planted there, I think it will last for many years. Because for this land of New Spain, the Catholic faith has done nothing more than pass through it as through a road. So that sort of landscape is really quite extraordinary. So here's this final bit, just one last thing here. I think what's really striking to me about Sahagún's interruption of his work to write about the epidemic and to reflect on this particular corner of collapse is the way in which it's a rupture in so many ways from the rest of the work. And then also, I want to say a temporal rupture, because the work otherwise closes in with the arrival of Cortez, right? But here's this other another rupture. So there's a little asterisk. I don't know if you can see that there. And then it refers to a section right down there. It refers you to that section. So he's asking the reader, future imagined reader, I don't know who, to pray for us, right? So he says, plega nuestro Señor de remediar esta tan gran plaga, porque a durar mucho todo se acaba. So pray for us that this ends, because if it lasts any longer, everything is over. So for Sahagún and his brethren, the Christian landscape now a marred landscape, the ecclesia, the landscape of the Ecclesia ex mortuis, a broken landscape, an empty landscape. Okay. So I want to shift gears now and this will be the last 5-10 minutes here. I want to talk now about how I'm trying to access, it's more difficult, but how I'm trying to access indigenous responses to the epidemic. I don't have indigenous languages, but also the sources, even in this period for this material, are hard to find and few exist at all, right? So I need to look at published materials, visual sources as well. But I want to kind of contrast what I would say the emerging Christian imaginary of indigenous communities at the same time, in the same corner of collapse, in the same crisis, and how indigenous communities, Christian communities, are reconstituting themselves in the wake of this epidemic. So I want to say something about indigenous Christianity. So I would say one of the questions that really drives part of my work is to think about this paradox of colonial imposition of Christianity and the fact of indigenous Christian faith, right? That's the kind of thing I struggle with, right? How to talk about that, how to write about that. And so I want to say that, there's an argument, I'm not very versed with this material, but there's an argument, right, that says that epidemics, disease, and the origins of Christianity in the first century, right, first centuries, that those really help solidify the Christian church, right? Christianity was particularly prepared to deal with broken body in this way, with illness, with disease. And also there was a sort of a social factor, right, that allowed for Christians to care for each other and then facilitated their survival. I don't see evidence for anything like that in this period, right? What I want to say is that in central Mexico, according to the way I have come to understand my sources, that most indigenous communities were not, I would say that, and I've written, they immediately kind of recognized the potency of the Christian sacred, right? So there was a fairly immediate willingness to accept where conflict and violence occurred was rather around two areas of contest. One, Christian exclusivism, Christianity and no other. And then the other is Spanish European control over local Christian practice, right? So communities of indigenous Christians fought those two struggles, right? And that's where often the greatest violence happened as a result, right? As indigenous communities insisted on that. I want to say that this epidemic does not make people more Christian. It does not make more Christians. It is that communities that had already understood themselves to be Christian reasserted that in a particular frame. And so I want to talk about that as I close. This is a particular document that kind of gets at or sheds some light, I think, on how indigenous communities were seeing this epidemic. So Cocolitzli, the name that they give it, Coco from the Nahuatl, demolish, dismember, destroy, Itzli, or Litzli, blood, demolished by blood, destroyed by blood, laid waste by blood. You can see here is an illustration. This is a codex from 1607 by an anonymous indigenous author, written in Nahuatl for an elite indigenous audience, and it's an annal, so every year has its events, and this is for the year 1576. And you can see he's kind of bleeding here on this cross, which I think is kind of interesting, and with a friar with sunglasses or something. I don't know what's going on with him there. But anyway, so what the Nahua says accompanying these images about this epidemic is it talks about how the friars went home and home trying to care for the sick for a time, trying to rescue the sick, but then that ended. And the author writes, "Y fue," this is Spanish, I don't need to read the Spanish. Basically, that is when the bells stopped ringing. They stopped ringing for the dead, for the burials, and it was as if we had been abandoned in the church. So, but the sense that as the mendicant orders are retreating from indigenous communities, they've abandoned both the living and the dead. So the sources that I've found myself rereading over the last couple months, these are very famous maps. The mapas of the Relaciones Geográficas, they're a set, I think there's 167 of them in existence. They were part of an answer to a survey circulated by King Philip II in 1576, thereabouts, something like that. And it coincided, rather incidentally, the survey coincided with this period of collapse. There are 50 questions. These are circulated to pueblos, communities all over Mexico, all over actually New Spain. I'm focusing on the ones in mostly in the central Mexico, in Mexico proper. But question 10 in the survey asks for a map. And the idea was that the king wanted to survey his colony. He wanted to understand what resources there might be. Was trying to create, together thinking these would create a comprehensive map that he could use in some way. And both the answers to the questions are often referred to indigenous leaders in the communities because they're asking about local history and local resources and local languages. And then the commissioning of the maps also, in many instances, they're done by Indigenous artists and artisans. And they turn out to be completely useless for colonial purposes, completely illegible, completely bizarre, right? But they've been read, but they coincide precisely to this period of the end of this epidemic. And so I've been trying to reread them because I'm interested in visual sources and visual materials. I've been trying to read them as documents that are responding to the epidemic. And so the way that they've been regarded in the past by scholars, for example, Serge Grzinski, a beautiful scholar who writes about this period and writes about these maps, as memories to order. They are nostalgic. They are backward-looking. They are recalling a time of order, and we've now entered a time of disorder. And I am proposing to read them in a different way, as actually a projection of local communities into the future in a kind of Christian landscape, written on a Christian landscape. And so, and where scholars who've looked at them before are interested in indigenous motifs, indigenous writing, pictographs, iconography, I'm really interested to trace the Christian images and Christian symbols on these maps. And so you can see the intersection of roads and churches is something I've been thinking quite a bit about. So there's one map in particular that I want to talk about. This is one of the more famous maps. And so my suggestion, basically, the way that I'm reading these, because they're sent to the king, right, that these local communities, these local communities of indigenous Christians, right, have now mapped Christian architecture, Christian buildings, right, the Christian church, Christian symbols, onto their local cosmological imagination, right? And so they are, I'm suggesting a kind of proffered covenant. Covenants often follow cataclysm, right? For a way forward for these local communities, right? And if I had more time, I would talk about the Altepetal, which is the Nawa ethnic unit that is the sort of thing on which indigenous communities insist in the conquest that will survive. It is the ethnic state could be very small. There were 300 of them in the larger part of Mexico when the Spanish arrived. And so my argument is that these maps, and like this map of Teozacualco, that they are inscribing that Christian imaginary onto the landscape of the Altepetal and proposing a local, sovereign Christianity, right? Bounded, territorially bounded, right? These are boundary markers all around. These pictographs of toponyms, they're boundary markers, right? Marking space and sort of inscribing Christian space within this frame. And I want to say, of course, if you want to read Mesoamerican maps, David Carrasco is the person to help with this. So he's written beautifully about that. So what captures my attention here is at the very center of this map is this image of a church, and next to it an early colonial palace, and the way that interfaces with these other figures, which are indigenous lineages, royal lineages, right? And the space of this town, this Altepetal, that interacts with only outward to its indigenous history. I think about, it's hard to see here, and the quality of the slide isn't that good, but these roads, thinking about roads and landscape, have footprints, which is very traditional to pre-Hispanic Mesoamerican cartography. They have footprints on them that run all around the church, right? So thinking about circumambulation and the way in which the person is bound to that community and the sacred is made through walking and the paths that are walked around this church. So this, I think that many of these maps can be read as a proffered covenant, right? We move forward as Christian on these terms, right? And so here you have, for example, this royal lineage that kind of grows out of the church palace structure, right, in reference to that structure. So I'll just close by saying that, that in kind of tracing these two Christian landscapes, right, distinct Christian landscapes, one that projects into the future, Indigenous Christianity into the future, and one that suggests that Christianity is dead in any form we would have wanted, right? So kind of delineating those two trajectories, right? In thinking about the collapse and the cataclysm, I have to say, and the way in which this cataclysmic event plays on both geological, religious, cosmological, and cartographic registers. It plays out on those registers, right? That in thinking about it, I've thought a lot about how I position myself as a scholar in relation to this cataclysm and in relation to the dead. And I'm moved by Edith Wischergrad and her thinking about her call to the heterological historian, right? She writes, in writing about the human-wrought death event before saying thus it was, the heterological historian is willing to pronounce the words, it ought not to have been thus. So, thank you.